to study Parshat Noach. Um, I believe for myself, this was maybe the first encounter I had with Torah. Um, there's like very vivid memories of uh being in preschool and seeing two animals walk towards the ark. And I think in some ways this parsha um is sort of seen as the kids parsha. And it is for me beautiful to be in a virtual space with adults to study this. I was speaking with Rabbi Ari Sachs for just a moment prior to uh, letting us all into the Zoom room. And I can say that this sounds like a very adult Torah study. We are going to have some really big and important questions that we're going to address. Doreen, I see your hand. This is going to be a participatory class, so I will certainly call on you first when we get there. But I will now turn it over to Rabbi Ari Sachs.
Uh, Thank you, Mara. I really appreciate the time and really excited to be able to learn with you again. Last time I was here was for Parshat Ve'etchanan back in the summer, and really excited to be able to learn with you. And yes, this is not a kids-friendly teaching. It's almost like I think I can it to the Purim holiday. That Purim we've turned into this great kids holiday of dressing up and doing the Rosh Hashanah, doing the Groggers and booing Haman. But the Purim story is anything but child friendly. So to some extent, this is also not a very child friendly parsha. But we're actually not going to be talking about sort of the evil nature of human beings. Rather, we're actually talking about God, and particularly about the development of God within the context of this parasha. Because one of the most important things that I've learned through my own schooling, and I'm a JTS ordained rabbi, also went to Machon Shechter in Israel, is that you cannot take the personhood of God out of God. That is to say that when it comes to reading Torah, we have to read God as a character in the story, because a lot of the different emotions, a lot of the different feelings, a lot of the senses of what God is all about is supposed to be relatable to us as human beings, because God, as our creator, God is the one who made us in God's own image, is going through the process of learning of what it means to have created human beings in all of creation. In fact, one of my teachers, Dr. George Savran, formerly of the Machon Shechter Institute, who I got a lot of this learning from for this parasha, he talked about how that God learned the mistakes of the first sets of creation with Adam and Eve. It's like, oops, should not have put them in the garden. Or when it came to Cain and Abel, it's like, I don't think I should actually have taken only one sacrifice because it leads to my children wanting to destroy each other. So that it's actually the process of God learning. And I think that we have come to this notion that God is either too different from us, or this spirit that exists around us, or is completely perfect in all different ways. When Torah teaches us, and especially in this parasha, that God is one who learns. God changes. And also that there are different senses or different understandings of who God is or what God believes God's self to be. In fact, part of what I think that we're going to get out of our learning is that in one sense, it seems that God thinks that I'm greater and I am different than all of my creation. And in another sense, maybe God is actually the same as we are, or similar as we are. So that's going to be the dynamic between the two, between different voices of almost like within the sense of God that comes out in this parasha. But I want to be able to say kind of B'Shem Omro of where I kind of have gotten a good amount of this learning. I mentioned Dr. George Savran, formerly of Machon Shechter Institute in Israel, in Jerusalem. Also, he also builds off of some of the work from Dr. Yair Loberbaum of the Shalom Hartman Institute, particularly on some of his work on biblical understanding of God. And then as well, I'm actually going to throw in a little H.L. Ginsburg, formerly of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and some of his work on ancient Near Eastern mythology and articulation of how Torah text relates to the time frame at which it came out. So, with all that, here's how we're going to break it down. We're not, when it comes to this parsha, we're going to talk about two different points of the story. We're going to talk about the introduction to the flood, the introduction to the whole story, and then we're going to talk about the aftermath. So we're not going to talk about the flood at all. We're not going to talk about the Tower of Babel or anything like that. We're just going to talk about the two introductions to the flood story, one of which actually begins in last week's parsha, and the two different ways in which the conclusion is made with the making of some aspect of a brit, some aspect of a covenant between God and human beings. So, with that, you should have the sheet with you. I'm not going to be sharing the sheet on the screen because there are going to be a couple points in which I'm going to be asking for your help. I'm going to be asking for an answer to a question that I would love for you to be able to help answer, especially because I'm going to be using a decent amount of the Hebrew. I'm going to be kind of going through a translation at the same time as reading it in the Hebrew. You'll be able to follow along pretty closely if you just follow along with the English, but also if you have that Hebrew knowledge, feel free to kind of add that in, especially when I'm asking some specific questions. So we're going to start with the first introduction, and that actually appears at the very end of Parashat Breshit, which is found on chapter 6, verses 5 through 8. 5 through 8. So, Vayara Adonai ki rabba ra'at ha'adam ba'aretz. So God saw that there was all this great ra'ah. There's all this great, often translated as evil, but just really bad stuff of humans in the land. V'chol yetzer machshavot libo, and all of the inclination of the thoughts of their hearts, really. Libo here is talking about all of human beings almost as one, but it's also kind of like this general. So I'm going to translate it as the hearts of all humans. Rak kol hayom. So what he's doing, what God is doing here, what Hashem is doing here is being able to identify that the heart of human beings is considered to be bad. Which, by the way, if God created human beings, doesn't that mean that God created us with a bad heart? So what's God doing here? And in fact, how does God react to the fact that he's now identifying, or that God is now identifying? And by the way, just as a side note, I will probably use he to refer to God because that's how I grew up. I don't mean anything necessarily by it, but it's just going to come out at times. So that he senses that the ways in which human beings, that their hearts are bad, are evil in some kind of way. So doesn't that actually affect God's character? And this is fascinating then. Vayinachem Adonai ki asa et ha'adam ba'aretz vayit'atsev el libo. I'm going to skip translating the Vayinachem part because I really want to get your thoughts about what that means. But whatever Vayinachem means, God, that's how God was because of what human beings were doing. And it almost seems as if it's like trying to explain a little bit what Vayinachem means. Vayitatsev el libo, which I would translate that as he made, or like he got that feeling of being sad to his heart, almost like it was a directional thing. Like it's like, oh, I'm disappointed. I'm a little disappointed. Now, along those lines, I'm curious, how do you understand the term Vayinachem? Does anyone want to give a sense as to what that phrase would mean? We often translate it as, here it's translated as regretted, but there, a sense of comfort as well, because that's a root for Noach, or like Nachom, Nachamti, Nachamu, Ami, that same sense of feeling that sense of comfort. So I guess I'm wondering, like, what is that idea of Nechem? And I'm specifically wondering, what kind of emotion is it? Or is it possibly not an emotion. Anybody have a thought on this? Any answers? Like, what is that vayinachem? Okay. Since I'm not getting necessarily, I don't see anyone kind of popping up on the screen.
I think we might be some visual learners, and so I
Got
just
it. All right.
shared my screen.
If that's easier, I'm also happy to do it that way. If you prefer that way.
I can share the screen so you can see everyone.
Sounds good.
Great.
Sounds good. So the phrase vayinachem here, it is one in which it is translated as regretted. What Dr. Savran points out is that the feeling of regret here, or the feeling of whatever this nechem is, because of vayitatsev el libo, that God is feeling saddened almost in a directional way to his heart, that it's not as if he's making a commentary about how God himself is, but rather that God is realizing that this creation that he made is not what God intended it to be, and he's not taking it personally. Thus, vayinachem is not an emotional term. Right? If you think about how when we are dealing with a difficult situation and we get very angry and upset, that's like our emotional human response often. But like if we have to think a little bit, if we have to, take it calmly, be able to deal with the issue on a bit of a higher level, then it's like, okay, well, we kind of go above our humanness in a way and say, all right, so by virtue of me not taking this personally, I'm able to deal with this challenging situation in a better way. And often, like if let's say a friend of yours or let's say a loved one does something really bad, one of those ways I think that we often think about as a better way of handling it is to say, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. I'm just disappointed. So here is an unemotional God who is above human beings. That seems to be the opening to this. Okay. Now we're going to keep on going. So it says now the next phrase, Vayomer Adonai emche et ha'adam asher barati me'al pnei adama me'adam ad behema ad remes ve'edof hashamayim ki nichamti ki asitim. It's almost like that phrase is, he's not necessarily saying, I'm going to wipe them out because I'm so angry with them. It's like, all right, this didn't work. That stinks. I may have to restart. So almost like God is learning about how to create and is not thinking about human beings or all of creation as everything about him, that he's so upset about what happened because it speaks to God's own persona, and therefore is acting as that creator of saying, I created this didn't work. I created that's not going to work. I created this, maybe this will work. And by the way, there's a beautiful midrash, I forget exactly where it is, that God went through many different kinds of creations until God landed on creating us, as if to say that, yes, when you're creating something, doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to get it right the first time. Probably not. And so that seems to be the introduction here. And then it says, V'Noach matzachem be'enai. And almost like that sense of that feeling of regret, this Noach character, whoever it might be, that Noach found some favor in God's eyes. So I was like, okay, maybe I will try it again with this one individual, or to maybe put another way, maybe Noach is actually the next iteration of creation of the world. So Adam and Eve actually didn't start the world. That was a creation that was destroyed, but rather it's Noach who is now this new Adam. And in fact, if we think about the rest of the Parashat that we don't talk about, I'm not going to talk about here, that out of Noach, you get all of the other nations of the world that populate the world, that you populate the different tribes. So really, Noah begins the world out of that sense of, okay, I regret what happened with this people, but I'm going to try again, kind of in an unemotional way. That's this introduction. All right. Now, let's go down to the next introduction. next Mavo, which is verses 9 through 13.
Rabbi, just I want
Yeah.
to, before we get into the text, I do want to just note there are some hands
Oh,
raised.
I don't see that. That's why.
Okay.
Oh, I see it. I see Dina. Okay. Oh, I
And
see also.
we have someone L.
Beautiful.
So should we pause for
Yes.
some
Let's
questions?
pause.
Okay,
Let's
great.
pause for this, and I'll take
We'll
everything that they say.
we'll
Yeah.
take two questions. We'll go to
Got it.
L and then Dina. L, are you there?
El Boni.
Okay, we'll go to Dina.
I'm here, but I didn't know what
Oh,
to say.
Okay, go to her first.
I don't know who was L. I don't know the name as well. My question, when you were talking at verse 6 about God regretted, and you see, when you come further, it says he had regretted making man.
El, we can't really hear you. Can you come closer to the mic?
Can you hear me better now?
A little better now. Yeah.
Yes. When you look at verse 6, it says God regretted making man on earth. Because earth was there before when you said it was void and you put man on it. You know, that's the part that's always tricky to me. He regretted making Adam on earth. It saddened his heart. You know, that's my question. On earth.
thank
On
you.
earth. Okay. Got it. Thank you. I'll look into that. And then we have Dina.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're muted again. There you go.
All right. Okay. This is a really complex thing, but I was thinking that since we're discussing God as being personal, perhaps even though he knows everything, maybe he is still learning. So he made a mistake with this group of people, and he decides that yes, he's going to start all over again, but he didn't quite make a mistake with everybody. So there's Noah and his family. And somebody had asked about why are the animals being punished also. And maybe because there were at that point in time too many predatory animals. We don't know what animals there were in existence at that time, and being so many predatory animals, maybe he decided not to have so many predatory animals. And we have zebras, which aren't predatory, but we also have lions. But this is a lot more complicated than what we learned when we were going
It certainly is.
Sunday
So
school.
why don't we hold? Thank you for Dina and for El. We'll come back to Wendy and Susie. I know you had put your hands up, so I'm going to have you come on for after the next bit. So hold on to your comments, and if you want to add more. So I want to keep in mind. So El, you're talking about that sense of Aretz and sort of what about this land that is already there, and to what extent is that the issue, or about is it just human beings on the earth? And also, I think that Dina, what I'm also hearing what you're saying is, to some extent, do the animals deserve it? Or, and when it comes to human beings, that maybe this is God realizing that I made a mistake. And I want us to think about this in regards to how we want to understand what's going inside of God. Because when we look at the beginning and now of verse, the other introduction, which is almost like a different way of almost thinking about how God might be feeling, that there's something else going on here that adds, or that also kind of runs in tension with what we just read. So here we go, verse 9. Ela todot Noach ish tzadik tamim haya b'dorotav, et Elohim hitalech Noach, vayela Noach shlosha banim et Shem et Cham bet Yafet. This is, we just get the introduction of Noach. I actually want to skip that piece really and go to verse 11. Vatishachet haaretz lifnei ha'Elohim, vatimale haaretz chamas. So this is now we get into much more strong negative kind of language. Vatishachet, corrupt. And by the way, here it's that the land has become corrupt. So coming back to El, to what you're referring before, it's that in the first Mavo, in the first intro, that you have, it's people on the land, but it's not the land itself. And now it's just everything on the land. And now the entire land is completely corrupt. And as it says here, is lawlessness. kol basar et darko ala aretz. It's all of creation. It's not just human beings. And I think that that's key. It's not just that we are disappointing God. It's that everything is not working out the way it's supposed to be. But here's the difference. Before, we saw that God was regretting it almost as if I'm disappointed, but it doesn't speak to who he is. And now take a look at this next verse. Vayomer Elohim leNoach, ketz kol basar ba lefanai, ki mala'a ha'aretz chamas mipnehem, vehineni mashchitam et ha'aretz. Now I'm adding a little kind of emphasis in here, but God saw this, and then he's speaking. This is the first time we actually have God speaking. Everything else in the first section was almost, God wasn't talking to anybody else. God wasn't talking to Noah. God was talking almost to himself. It's like God speaking to his own heart, like, "Oi, I'm a little sad. I'm disappointed. So I guess I'm going to do this." And by the way, we kind of have that a little bit later on when God is speaking to God's self about deciding to should I tell Abraham about what's happening about Sodom and Gomorrah? Should I do that? And here, it's not God speaking to God's self. God lashes out. God reaches out to Noah, who may be the reason why Noah is the one who is able to save them, is because only Noah could actually be the one to hear it. You know how like sometimes when you get really angry, you take it out on somebody, but somebody who's close to you, somebody who it may not necessarily be their fault, but they're the ones who just happen to be near you. I wonder if Noah is like that. Noah is like that individual who God is kind of saying, I have all of this bent up rage over what is happening to this earth. In other words, God is angry. In the first one, God doesn't seem to be angry. Here, God does seem to be angry. In the first one, God's raising God's self above that, you could call it human emotion, but here, God is full of that rage. And that's a difference in terms of thinking about then what does that flood actually do? All right, I want to pause there. I know Wendy and Susie. So first, Wendy.
Hi, thank you. So when you said that this parsha actually starts a little bit before in the earlier parsha, there is this reference to divine beings cohabiting with humans. And I'm just wondering whether there's any commentary on, like, maybe this wasn't God's fault and this wasn't humans' fault. Like, humans were made in God's image. We don't know whether the divine beings were made in God's image. We don't really have any reference. So maybe God was upset with the fact that there were these sort of half human, half divine beings and needed the do-over because of that.
Right. It's a fascinating point. I don't have a good answer to that question now. The only thing I'll say with this is Dr. Neil Gilman, Zichrono Livracha from JTS, we're talking about this parsha. He said that the reason why this parsha, the previous parsha ended with Noach is because the Torah likes to just end on something nicer, which is why it ended with Vihine, like Noach matzachen be'enai, more than anything else. But also could just be that link between the two. So it might be something, it may not necessarily be something. But thank you, Wendy. Susie, and then we're going to move on to the next piece. And I see all the other hands for when we come back. Susie.
Great.
All right, okay, thank you.
Great.
Thank you. I'm seeing this a wee bit differently.
Please.
From my perspective, which is, nothing, there is no point to us if we do not have free will. It's completely pointless.
Okay.
I think God has faith in us and to make these choices, but also knows that we are going to fail and we have to be taught lessons or directed. God could have destroyed the earth and everyone. He didn't.
Right.
Instead, he told Noah he was going to do that. And Noah stepped up to the plate.
So,
and because of that, and finding goodness in that one person, he didn't.
Right.
The other thing I had a little trouble with was, it is a reboot in a way, but Noah still is a descendant of Adam and Eve's. So it's not a different gene pool.
Right. So I'll respond quickly to the last piece, and then I want to reframe the first one, because I think that the point that you're making is so critical. And it's actually what I think this parsha is doing is the opposite of what we normally think this parsha does. To the last point you're saying, you're absolutely correct that Noah is a descendant from Adam. The point I'm trying to make here is that this is a reboot, and almost to read it in a certain way as if he is the new Adam in some capacity, regardless of whether or not he is descended from Adam directly. He is the new Adam. Or to put it another way, my kids like to say, oh, we're all like the same. We all descend from Adam. Really, we all descend from Noah in terms of thinking about the fact that we have all the tribes that follow afterwards. The piece though that I want to raise is that I think that the point that you're saying about free will is so critical, because in many ways that is how we take the stories from Torah, that it's learning about us as human beings. But what I think is so fascinating about reading Noach in this way, and in order to do this, we need to get through the next two pieces, is that the story isn't about us, it's about God. It has nothing to do with us. It has, and even the brit, even the covenant that seems to be appearing later, the rainbow, it's not about us. It's actually all about God. And therefore, free will really isn't even the issue here. It's all about God as the development of God's character within the context of Torah. So what I'd like to do is to just hold off for the next. I'm going to get some more towards the a bunch at the end, because I want to get through the next two kind of conclusions to this particular section that I think are really, really powerful. Also in thinking about reframing the story, because what we just glossed over in this discussion is the entire flood itself, all the things that happen in the flood. And now we get to the very end, and this is what happens at the very end. You have chapter 8, verses 20 through 22. And if you take a look at chapter 8, verses 20 through 22, it says, Vayiven Noach mizbeach l'Adonai vayikach mikol behema tahora mikol ofa tahor vayal olot b'mizbeach. Basically, God brought a lot of sacrifices. Vayarach Adonai et reach hanichoach. And God was able to smell the pleasing odor. And notice, by the way, with the Hebrew, reach nichoach comes from the same root as Noach, comes from the same root possibly as Nacham, which is not necessarily about the fact that Nacham means regret before, or that Noach means comfort, and Nichoach here means pleasing, but rather that it's a relatively unemotional term. It's like you smell something and it's nice and it's pleasing, but it's not something that gets you so excited. And one of the points that that Dr. Savran had made is that there's certain words that appear in Torah that seem to be emotional. Like, let's say tov, that this, like today was good, right? That day one God created, that all of creation was good, or it was very good. And what he said was that tov is actually not really an emotional term. It's like okay, that's a good thing. But it's not like so full of that anger or that love or that passion even. And so the nichoach here is actually a sense of calm, almost like you give some kind of odor that calms somebody down, that regulates their behavior. So gets this calming influence, the calming thing from this reach nichoach. Vayomer Adonai el libo. Again, that phrase from the first mavo, from the first introduction. God is like speaking to his own heart, not speaking to Noach. Lo osif lekalel ored adama ba'avor ha'adam ki yetzer lev ha'adam ra min urav v'lo osif od lehakota kochaya kasher asiti. This line is really about God speaking to God's own self, to like within God's own persona, that the people are not going to change. Correct? The same language, Rav min urav, that they are evil, as it says, they're evil from their youth, that it's a part of who these creatures are. And yet, even though that is the case, I'm not going to destroy them. I'm not going to do this anymore. So that it's more just God hasn't necessarily changed his mind about people. If you want to talk about free will for a moment, that God knows that we're going to be doing lots of bad things, and that it's not about God being so angry or joyful about it. If you want to think about God also as, that carries the persona of some anti-God within, but rather that by virtue of the fact that God is in a calm state, God's going to say, okay, you know what? I'm just not going to destroy them. I'll allow the seasons to exist, right? Ad kol yemei haaretz, zera v'katzir v'kor v'chom v'kayitz v'choref v'yom v'layla lo yishpotu. So long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. In other words, that the sign of the covenant, the sign of the promise that this is never going to happen is not here the rainbow, because that hasn't appeared yet, but rather it's that all of the seasons will continue to exist. The world will continue to function. I'm not going to destroy the actual land itself, which is interesting given the comment that Ella, you made before about destroying human beings off of the land or destroying the entire land. Kind of as we also saw in the second introduction, that it was talking about the entire land was destructive, the entire land was awful, saying, no, the land is going to continue on. I'm never going to go through any of this kind of destruction again because I'm calm. Seemingly, I am calm. But let's see if that actually is the response to God's own anger from maybe the second introduction, because God was full of that rage. Or maybe there's another way for God to deal with God's own rage. And that's where we get to the next the next way to describe the covenant. So we can go down on the screen to, this is chapter 9. All right. There's a lot in here. I'm going to skip a lot of it because of time, and I want to get to some of your questions. So I'm going to move all the way down to verse 8, right? The covenant, a lot of that covenant is the Noachide covenant, which we could have a whole Parsha class on that, is from earlier, but I want to focus on verse 8. All right.
It's possible that there are marks for verses, but I'm not actually.
Oh, I don't see it here. Okay, I see it. I don't know why it's not being there. So let's see. The marks go down to where it says, and God said to Noah, and God said to Noah to his sons. So, and God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant. Okay. And God said to Noah and to his sons with him, all right, I'll do in Hebrew. Vayomer Elohim el Noach ve'banav ito lemor, va'ani hineni mekim et briti itchem ve'et zarachem acharechem. I'm going to make my brit. I'm going to make my covenant. Now, what is a covenant? What is an actual brit? If we think about what a brit is, the best example that we have, especially from a parsha that comes a little bit later on, is a brit milah, is the actual circumcision as this covenant. So it's some kind of sign. It's some kind of way of indicating that this covenant, this promise is going to be made of this relationship between, whether it's a brit milah between a Jewish family, a Jewish child, a Jewish male child with God, or perhaps what we're about to see, between God and us. Now, but here's the thing, this brit has to be done that everybody could be a part of. That's for the entire land, for all of creation. It's not just for human beings. And this, the purpose of this brit, right? The purpose of this brit is to say that I'm never going to destroy you again with this flood. Okay. Now we get to the good stuff. Vayomer Elohim zot ot habrit asher ani noten beni uveinechem uvein kol nefesh chaya asher itchem ledorot olam. Here is the ot habrit. It doesn't actually say what the brit is, but it just says that there is going to be this sign, this ot, this indication of this covenant. That's what I was mentioning earlier from the idea of the brit milah. There is this action, there is the circumcision, that is the sign of this promise. By the way, that is the reason why according to halacha, you cannot have a brit milah done prior to 7 days, and it should not be done by somebody who is just a doctor. It has to be done by a mohel, because the purpose of the circumcision is not to be circumcised. The purpose of the circumcision is to be a brit. and specifically in that manner of that relationship with God. So it has to be done for that particular purpose. So now we get to what we think the breed is. Et kashti natati be'anan vehaita leot brit beini uvein haaretz. This is so fascinating. My bow that will be in the clouds, that will be the oath of my covenant between me and between the land. Now, let's not gloss over this idea of the bow, because it doesn't say rainbow. That would be like keshet, my keshet geshem or something. It just says my bow. So what is a bow? A bow is a weapon. And particularly a bow is a weapon used by ancient Near Eastern gods. There is a very well-known, there is a North Canaanite myth of Anan and Akat. Akat is a god, Anan was a human, and Anan as a female human wanted to be loved by Akat and said, Akat, give me your bow, which has some also, you could say is very sexual kind of connotations to it. But in particular, that bow is Akat's weapon. And in fact, Akat's response, and this comes from H.L. Ginsberg in his reading of this particular North Canaanite myth, Akat says, my bow is for soldiers, not for women folk. My bow is for soldiers, not for women folk. So I want you to think about this for a second. God has basically destroyed the world. God has unleashed this power, and this feels a little bit more like that God who's full of that rage. And what is his sign? His sign is his weapon. His sign is his weapon, which doesn't make any sense. How would a weapon be the sign that I'm never going to destroy the world again? That doesn't necessarily make any sense. It's almost as if you have a king who is out there and says, I will never destroy you again, and then lifts up a great sword for everybody to see, be like, I will never destroy you. I don't think I would feel that safe. I don't think I would feel that safe in that moment. So what if, though, that the bow was not meant for the people? It's not meant as a way to say that the rain will never come again. What if the bow was actually a sign for God, as a reminder for God to never do this again? Keep going. V'zacharti, I'm sorry. V'haya be'ani, be'anini anan al haaretz, v'nir ata hakeshet be'anan. This is a very strange verse. First, what is v'haya be'anini anan? It says, when I bring clouds over the earth? Not really. Anani anan has a sense of, I am the cloud in the cloud. And this is where I'll bring in Dr. Yair Lorberbaum, who says that this specific phrase, this anani anan, is a way to describe God's wrath, God's anger. The same way as afchori, this sense of like a nostril flaring, is also a sign of God's anger. This phrase is God's anger, which means when my anger is in the clouds, and venir ata hakeshet, and the bow is seen in the cloud, v'zacharti et briti, I will remember my covenant with the people. Think about that for a second. And also think about kind of like the picture in your mind, right? It is raining, it is pouring. You have this cloud, this dark, stormy cloud. That in many ways is the bow. It's not the rainbow that appears afterwards saying, oh, it's all good. It's actually that this bow is what is inside the cloud that is currently happening to us. Be'aneni anan. This bow will be in my clouds. And the purpose of that bow being in the clouds is not for us to see it. It's for God to see it, because God needs to remember the covenant, which means that God might forget the covenant. Because why would you need a reminder unless you may forget? This is the clearest example of the anthropomorphic idea of God, that God is developing, God is learning, and God is also needs to make reminders just like us to say, I need to be reminded about how to do the right thing. And so what better way to remind me about my power over people and that I should not use the power than by noticing the bow that I have in this cloud that can destroy the people. That needs to be my reminder that I will not do it again. And it's almost as if God is stronger than all of us, because God's able to look at the thing that God is using to destroy us and say, this is my sign to not destroy them, that my patience, my abundant kindness, El Rahum v'Chanun Erech Apayim v'Rav Chesed v'Emet Notzer Chesed Lalafim, like my kindness needs to abound, needs to grow, and I have that ability. And so I'm going to look at the thing that I would use to destroy people, and I'm going to turn that into something beautiful, into something that will actually be able to be seen by the rest of the world as a sign of my love and my affection and my remembrance of the Brit, that everyone will see this new iteration of that bow and then be able to offer the blessing because they know that I have remembered the covenant. Not that you human beings have to remember the covenant, but that I will remember the covenant. I think it's such a powerful way of seeing God in this beautiful anthropomorphic way that I feel like is much more, brings God closer to us. And at the same time, because we have these other sections, that it's also talking about God recognizing that God needs to be bigger than us. And it's this tension between the character of God that I think makes Torah just so absolutely fascinating. And so with that, we'd love to get some thoughts.
Wow, do we have some thoughts? I cannot do the chat justice, but I do invite people to take a look at that. Andrea, you've had your hand up for a while.
I have trouble thinking of the anthropomorphizing, I guess is the word, of God as being a description of what God is experiencing, and rather a pablumized version that's good enough that we can understand. That it's not really God experiencing these human-like emotions and human-like anger, but it's rather there's some phenomena that God is experiencing, and that's already a limiting word, experiencing, that can only be described that has to be described in human words for us to understand it. It's more of a reflection on us and our limitations than it is a reflection on God.
Thank you, Andrea. Appreciate that. Appreciate your thoughts.
We can go to Ellen.
So I was having a couple thoughts, and one of them is that when God does this whole flood and these people are evil and all that, it's kind of like when we blame a small child instead of holding the parents somewhat responsible.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's kind of like, God, maybe you didn't set out such great parameters, and maybe you didn't do such a good job with this, and maybe you needed to teach people this, and that kind of thing. And it kind of brings me to my second point, which is that this is a male God figure.
Yeah.
Before that, we have female God figures or goddess figures, which characteristically are more nurturing. And yes, there is some life and death and that kind of thing too. But I think overall they're a little bit more mature. They're a little bit more like understanding and nurturing and teaching. And so I just find that in this period of time historically, perhaps, and when we're talking about it, Torah time versus like Noah time, we're talking about shift over from a female deity type figure to a male deity figure. And so, those are just my thoughts there.
Thank you so much, Ellen.
Thank you, Ellen. And oh my gosh, it's 11:15. How did that happen? Rabbi, there's lots of
Yes.
hands open that are raised. What is the best way for people who have thoughts? I'm gonna write my email in the chat. But if they're
Sure.
uh,
People can send me an email. I'd be happy to receive.
great, I'm happy to forward anything your way. And I'm normally, paying attention to the time, but you are such a wonderful speaker that I did not see the clock hit 11:15. Before we head out, you gave us a lot of text. You gave us a lot to think about. Can you share like a closing thought, an intention, a bracha before we go into Shabbat?
So my bracha is that one of the core fundamentals of Judaism, or really of any faith tradition, is a feeling like we have a connection to something that is greater and bigger. And there's a gap between what we know and what we don't know. That gap is important. It is a sense of humility that we cannot understand God. We cannot understand what that thing is greater. And yet, when we feel that there are moments in which we have not clarity, but a sense of connection, it means that if you're to take this on like a plane where we are on Haaretz and God is on Shamayim, that we are not going all the way up to meet God, and God is not coming all the way down to meet us, but that we go somewhere in the middle. We raise ourselves, and God raises God's self down. And so that is the brit about a relationship, that as we go through our lives, as we go through our days, our weeks, as we go through life, that it is hard to just feel as if we are alone in this world. And that to have that sense of something greater means that we have to raise ourselves to an even higher level. But that if we truly want God to be there for us, we are asking God to come down to ours too. And a text like this, I think, reminds us that God is like us, just like we are like God. B'tselem Elohim bara oto, in God's image, we were created, and therefore, God has part of us in God, and we have a part of God in us. So my prayer for all of us is to take the prayer that we offer when we see a rainbow, to say, let's remember what that covenant is between us as human beings with God, in a way where God can be real in our lives, and we can sense that presence, we can sense that promise and that covenant and that relationship for now and forevermore. Baruch atah Adonai, Zocher Habarit. Praised are you, O God, who remembers the covenant.
Amen. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you all. I wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and we hope to continue learning with you next week. Bye-bye.
Take care.